Chapter 9, section 6, again being split up into 2 days. So day 1, guess what? We're solving quadratics again. We've already solved them by graphing, we've solved them by factoring, we've solved them by square rooting. What else is there? Well, here's the general equation again, the standard form of a quadratic, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. We're going to do a formula called the quadratic formula that doesn't work, that we use it for when it doesn't work to use by graphing. We get problems that aren't factorable. Square rooting isn't an option. There's a lot going on there. So, quadratic formula looks like this. Can you believe that? Look at it. X equals negative b, or the opposite of b. There's our plus or minus that we got from our square roots solving. The square root of b squared minus 4ac all over, or divided by 2a, and we'll break it up and we'll just work with parts of it a little bit here and there at a time. So 3x squared plus 5x minus 8 equals 0. If you can see that, I color coordinated that for you. We do need to know, like we did for vertex and axis of symmetry, what's a, what's b, and what's c. And in this case, a is 3, b is 5, c is negative 8. I didn't color code that perfectly and give it away too much, but c is negative 8. So from there, we're going to have to be able to put in the b's, the a's, the c's, and do a little calculating. What does that look like? It looks like the opposite of b. So b was 5, now we're going to write down negative 5. Plus or minus the square root of 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 8. And notice I just put those in there with little dots. And yes, I made this subtraction sign bigger than this little negative sign because you want that to be subtract. All over 2 times 3. But that again is going to be cleaned up a little bit before we put it in the calculator. First, we can calculate what is 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 8. Don't use the square root button. Just put in 5 squared minus 4 times 3 times negative 8 and get 121. But we know when we write it down, we have to actually write down square root of 121. You don't put the square root in, you just do the inside part. 2 times 3, we can take care of that, is 6. That looks a little bit easier to work with, a little bit smaller formula. It does still have x equals out in the front of it. From there, we now work it out and say, what is the square root of 121? If you don't have your perfect squares memorized, you'll use your handy-dandy calculator again, or ask Siri, what is the square root of 121? And it is 11. So, we need, there's no plus or minus sign on your calculator. I don't know how you could ask your calculator, hey, could you add this and subtract it at the same time? It can't. Nobody can. So we're going to separate this into 2 separate problems. First, we're going to take negative 5 plus, and the square root of 121 is 11. So first we're going to write negative 5 in parentheses plus 11 divided by 6. Excuse me. Then we're going to write x equals, in parentheses, what if we take negative 5 minus 11 divided by 6? We have to do 2 problems because there's 2 answers. I don't know if I need to remind you, but quadratics are parabolas. So 9 times out of 10, you're going to have 2 different answers. What's our answer when we plug this one in? Try it. Left parenthesis, negative 5 plus 11, right parenthesis, divided by 6. You're going to get x equals 1. Try it over here. X equals negative 5 minus 11. Make sure you use the parentheses. And when you divide it by 6, you're going to get a big ol' repeating fraction or decimal, but we will round it to the nearest hundredth at negative 2.67. And there are our two different answers. So it isn't so bad. And you're going to be using these over and over again in Algebra 2 and then in whatever you take after that, advanced algebra with trig or pre-calc. Quadratic formula ends up becoming people's favorite, if you can believe that. So here it is again. Write down 2x squared minus 5x plus 3 equals 0. A equals 2, the number in front of x squared. B equals negative 5. And C equals 3. If you remember, if you have your formula handy, we need the opposite of B. The opposite of negative 5 this time is positive 5. Plus or minus the square root, make a big old square root, of B squared. Notice that it's B squared. It's not negative B squared. It's not. We're just going to take 5 squared. This number is always going to be positive. And the reason why this number is always going to be positive is because we don't want to try to plug in a negative 5 in parentheses and squared when we know in our mind, we've done this enough, that any negative number when squared becomes positive. So why mess with the negative and the parentheses and all that? We're just putting in the B. B squared, 5 squared, minus 4 times 2 times 3, 4 times A times C, all over 2A, and I'm going to put 2 times 2. You could put 4 right away if you want to. And a reminder of what do we do first? First, I'm going to highlight it. First, we take care of not the square root, but just everything that's under the square root. Type in 5 squared minus 4 times 2 times 3. 5 squared minus 4 times 2 times 3. And I know a lot of times you guys just wait for me to do it for you, but you should double check and see if you can type that properly on your calculator. If you can see the glare, x equals 1. So we have 5 plus or minus the square root of 1, and 2 times 2 is 4. But I think everybody's okay with the idea that the square root of 1 is 1. So we're going to do 5 plus 1 in parentheses divided by 4, and 5 minus 1 in parentheses divided by 4. Calculate them both out. Don't forget to put x equals. And when you do this one, you should get 1.5. And when you do this one, you should get 1. Type it in with parentheses. And there's your two answers. And believe it or not, if you didn't believe me, if you took those answers one at a time, if you plugged in 1.5 for x and took 2 times 1.5 squared minus 5 times 1.5 plus 3 and hit equals, you would get 0. That's what we're finding every time. What value of x makes it equal 0, and it has to equal 0 or we can't solve it. If it's not set up to equal 0, then we're not doing a quadratic equation. Let's try this one more time. We'll only do 3 of them because you'll get the hang of it as you do your homework. A equals, there is a 1 in front of that x squared, so let's use that. B is 3, and C is negative 11. We want the opposite of B, negative B. The opposite of B is negative 3. Plus or minus the square root, always just put in a positive, B squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 11, all over 2 times 1, or 2 times A. Again, you could just put 2 right away, but I'm showing all of my work. Start with just the 3. 3 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 11. You get 50. Negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 50 over 2. Now, there is a little bit of a problem with that. The problem with that, go ahead and try to square root 50. So far, we've gotten perfect squares. And every time we got a perfect square, did I put 50? I did. I should have put 53. sorry. Every time we square root and we have a perfect square, we get a whole number. Well, we don't have a whole number this time. So we are going to have to type this in a little bit separately, a little bit differently. Let's write it down. Parentheses, -3 plus the square root of 53, parentheses, divided by 2. And then we'll do it again as -3 minus the square root of 53, parentheses, divided by 2. Because we can't, if we take the square root of 53, we have an irrational decimal that keeps going and going and going and going, so we can't write that down. If you have a calculator like mine, we've been working on this all year with our square roots and our parentheses and all that. This square root button gives you a parenthesis right here, which means if you look at your calculator, let's type this in. Left parenthesis, -3 plus square root 53, parenthesis. If you look at what I just put in the numerator, there are 2 left parentheses, but only 1 right parenthesis. We can't have 2 left parentheses and then only a single right parenthesis. We have to double that up. So finish your numerator with that outside parenthesis. This one really belongs in here. And then our second one belongs out there. It doesn't look that way on a calculator. And then you can divide it by 2. Double parenthesis after the 53, then divide it by 2 so that when you hit equals, everybody gets 2.14. You have to practice that on here and don't just take my word for it. Or if you're using your phone, figure out how to do it right. Now, another cool thing about my calculator, and yours if it's like this kind, TI-30EX, hit the up arrow. I don't have to retype this whole thing. If I have a plus sign right there, don't delete it, just go put a subtraction sign over the top of it. When you turn that into subtraction, it gets you the other half of your problem, -5.14. I should have put this one in blue. So when you solve it with a plus, you get 2.14. When you solve it with a negative or subtraction, you get -5.14. Try it, make sure it works. Good luck. We'll do part 2 in the next lesson.